Hi, everybody. My name is Ryan Kalember, and I'm the Executive Vice President of Cybersecurity Strategy at Proofpoint, a longtime Okta partner. In fact, some of my neighbors and best friends are Okta employees, so it's great to be here at Octane again. I'm going to be talking about a topic that is probably near and dear to all of our hearts: how we connect with the world, particularly in this work anywhere kind of age. Uh, this presentation is somewhat obviously titled Warning Your Connection is Not Secure, which is a prompt I think a few of us have seen over the years, but it's not the sort of thing that has to be a permanent condition. Now, if you're anything like me, you've burned through pretty much all of the Netflix and Disney Plus and HBO Max and Peacock and five other streaming platforms worth of content over the course of the last year or so. But my absolute favorite just dropped on Netflix. If you haven't checked it out yet, it's called Made You Look, a true story about fake art. And this might be a little bit of an odd place to start this presentation, but I think it's the perfect place. And I'll tell you a little bit about why. So you'll see three people at the bottom there. The woman on the right, in fact, was running something called the Nodler Gallery, which is New York's finest and most distinguished long-term art gallery, dealt with clients paying tens of millions of dollars for pieces of art. Now, the woman in the middle of the screen there, Glafira Rosales, showed up one day with an interesting story about a very wealthy collector, mysterious wealthy collector, who had undiscovered masterpieces from some of the most prominent artists of the last century. You see a Rothko up there to the upper left. You see a Jackson Pollock on the upper right. As it happened, despite the fact that this was one of the most distinguished art galleries in the world, not even just New York, and it was serving some of the most distinguished art collectors, again, with transactions worth millions and millions and millions of dollars. As it happened, that's not a Rothko. That's not a Pollock. Those were both painted by the guy on the lower left, who was a math professor in Queens who just happened to be really, really, really good at art forgery. I tell this story not just because it is an absolutely phenomenal story about what people can talk themselves into when money is on the line, but also really at the end of the day, it wasn't expertise or any amount of diligence that made it possible to trust what these communications were flowing in both directions. Right. So you had that Rothko where your eyes are telling you that's a Rothko. Mark Rothko's son looked at that and said, that's a Rothko, and it's a particularly good one. Ultimately, though, it didn't matter how much money was on the line. It was impossible to trust the people involved in the scheme. And it really was the sort of thing that makes it pretty extraordinary to try and figure out what trust looks like in the digital world by analogy. And here's something I never thought I'd say out loud. Just recently here, a JPEG. Yes, a JPEG. Uh, Also known as a non-fungible token, meaning a JPEG on the blockchain, was sold for $69 million, which is actually much more than that Rothko, the fake one, as well as the fake Jackson Pollock sold for. And the buyer of that by an artist called Beeple was a crypto investor using the pseudonym Metakovan. That's not a sentence I ever thought I'd say, but digital trust is a very, very, very different thing. So even though obviously the art world has evolved in a bunch of different ways, I start the presentation here because trust is difficult. Even though if you look at the kind of the latter model here, this is a non-fungible token. It's using the latest technologies, cryptocurrency, blockchain, all of which can be used to make sure that that piece of art is exactly what it says it is and could not have been forged in any sort of way. But at the end of the day, we're talking about a JPEG in the second case and an actual painting in the first. So let's talk about digital identity as it translates outside the art world. What of these things do you think is harder to fake? If you were to decide to become a scammer today and you were trying to manipulate somebody that you're connected to digitally, the way that we're all connected to each other, not only right now at this very moment, but throughout most of our lives, is it harder to pretend to send an email as them? Is it harder to fake a secure connection to a website? Is it harder to fake an IP address? Maybe it's harder to fake a domain name. This is a bit of a trick question because pretty much all of these things are trivially easy to fake. So ultimately, the things that we've tried to layer on top of the deeply insecure protocols that make the digital world work, whether that is SMTP underlying email, whether it is HTTPS underlying that little padlock you see in your browser, TCP/IP or DNS, none of them are secure by default. But we all depend on the interconnected digital world to get anything done whatsoever. So, what does that actually translate to in practice? Well, one of the obvious things that happened since we spoke last is that the last few organizations who were not thinking that people were their enterprise perimeter have probably found religion. It is blindingly obvious that at this point, the enterprise perimeter is effectively a human one. We are all using different endpoints, maybe managed ones, maybe not, sitting behind cable modems, connecting mostly to cloud applications, and interacting in ways that are both face to face and, like email, very much not face to face. So, with a perimeter like that, how then do you start to understand how to protect it? Because, frankly, people did become the perimeter over the last year or so, but attackers have been there for a while. If you are a hacker who is worth your salt or has at least done some really simple cost benefit analyses, you're looking at a world in which infrastructure is starting to move to the cloud. All of these cloud infrastructure providers and SaaS services are really hard targets. They have great security teams. They know exactly how to configure the least possible amount of attack surface. But what you're going after isn't there anyway. What you're going after is something that somebody has access to. And you can probably figure out who those people are. It doesn't really take much more than a Google search or maybe a quick browse around LinkedIn to figure out who is likely to at least be 1 degree of separation from the target that you ultimately want to go after. Attackers, of course, did add some interesting tricks over the last couple of years. For really well-defended organizations, they went after a slightly broader form of digital trust, the trust that we all have to have rather, in our ecosystem, in the third parties that we rely on, in our supply chains, our vendors, partners, people that we fundamentally rely on to get the work of our own organization done that work for very different organizations that might be protected in very different ways. None of their identities in a digital sense is all that easy to trust most of the time with the way that we've set up most of our digital infrastructure. And that really has become the defining feature of the modern threat landscape. Now, it is easy to conclude that cyber criminals are going after people to the exclusion of literally everything else that they could go after. And most of the data will back that up. That said, it is impossible to not acknowledge that, yes, if a cyber criminal is gifted a web shell sitting on an Exchange server, they will probably take advantage of that. So, yes, there was an event in March that breaks this trend, but you can think of it much like an evolutionary biologist would think of a punctuated equilibrium. Most of the time, cyber criminals are going after people, but if a bug happens to present itself and it happens to be super useful, maybe they'll turn back in the other direction from time to time. Ultimately, though, the social engineering at the heart of what cyber criminals do is what is ultimately powerful and continues to define how the threat landscape, I think, will look for years to come. Now, I wanted to choose this particular campaign because it shows just how much human interaction is required for the modern cyber criminal, a really good cyber criminal group, in fact, one of the threat actors that we have a lot of respect for in terms of tradecraft, to go after a single infection, malware infection on a single endpoint. Now you can see here, this is a message that uses the sort of social engineering that is tried and true. You've maybe seen messages that you hopefully did not click on that had similar lures embedded in them. It's a fake order. It has a plausible looking order number associated with it. There's some urgency there and that it will show up in 1 to 3 business days. This campaign was sent right before Valentine's Day, and it's, of course, impersonating a flower company. And it has an invoice attached to it in PDF format. The exact sort of thing that if something had gone wrong, via a courier, and you get a notification by the text message, you might actually feel enough urgency to open this up. So what happens when you open up that PDF? Interestingly, the PDF opens and you see what you see on the left there. Pretty convincing looking invoice that, any small business, maybe a flower shop, might have generated for you. And you can see how many fresh Carolina roses you're getting, how many Peruvian lilies, how many rainbow roses with premium greens, without a vase, importantly, comes as part of this order. Now, those of you who have lived in or been to New York, like myself, will immediately have noticed the one piece of social engineering that's broken here. Sales tax in New York is absolutely not 7%. But overall, this is pretty convincing. Now, there isn't anything even clickable inside this PDF. So now the social engineering has to take another step. There is, however, a URL, flowersny.net. Is that the real URL belonging to a flower shop in New York City? It is not, but you probably already guessed that. If you actually copy that into your browser, now again, you've opened an email, you've opened an attachment, you've copied a URL or manually typed it into your browser. So you're at your fourth point of interaction with what this threat actor has put together. If you do all of those things, then you actually have to enter an order number. The order number is what actually gets you to the next phase of the campaign, which abuses yet another brand, which is DocuSign in this case. This has nothing to do with DocuSign. This is just a threat actor copying their logo here, basically saying that somehow your invoice is encrypted by DocuSign. That's a common thing that threat actors do. Hilariously, they're also abusing the brands of Microsoft, McAfee, Symantec, which is no longer really Symantec, it's part of Broadcom, and RSA Security Analytics, which is what some of you on the cybersecurity side might know, actually sort of a network traffic analysis product and nothing to do with consumers, but a threat actor using Google might throw that logo right into a lure here. Again, none of this has yet gotten us to the malware. So now we're on step 5. We have to actually click that button at the top that says enable editing or enable content, depending on your system, that ultimately activates the payload. This is an extraordinary series of steps that you as a human have to go through to infect your computer with malware. And threat actors only have done this because the automated tools that we've built to detect badness are probably not going to act like a human here. They're not going to figure out that, oh, that's a URL underneath the phone number there, and there's an order number that I actually have to input in order to get to this other document, which is then going to have to actually have that yellow bar clicked on before the malware shows up. Really, you could not have picked a better example of the modern threat landscape, which, after all, exploits human vulnerability substantially more than it exploits technical vulnerability. So we have a human-targeted landscape that is ultimately powered by human-activated threats, and it exploits human connections. That really is where we find ourselves, but overall as an industry, we're not terribly focused on the human layer. And perhaps maybe we should be. If you ask Bernie, I will echo his message here. We are all asking you, once again, to start protecting your people. We've done a really, really nice job with a lot of different aspects of cybersecurity, but it does feel like we keep losing, like things keep going wrong, like we keep failing. But ultimately, at the end of the day, most of those failures are not technical failures. For sure, a few of them are, but if we focus on protecting our people, there is a way forward. Because when we fail to protect our people, that's where we see the big losses. Now, I'm just going to take 2 very, very simple data points here. Ransomware. You might think of ransomware as effectively a malware problem, but what it is it's effectively a phishing problem. Most large organizations that experience a ransomware attack had somebody go through some variant of that flower order malware installation that I just showed as an example. And in fact, if you had, and I buried the lead here a bit, if you had in fact enabled macros on that spreadsheet pretending to be DocuSign and 4 other things, you would have actually gotten a threat called a downloader, which might very well have led to a ransomware infection. On the other hand, this whole area of business email compromise, which is an unfortunate FBI acronym, BEC, that has entered the lexicon, that really just describes wire fraud that can either be in the form of small things like gift cards or even paychecks, all the way through to wire transfers in the millions or tens of millions, or in one case over $100 million. That, in the most recent year we have statistics for, is responsible for more cybercrime losses than every other form of cybercrime added all together. And that is a pure human problem. It is because we can't trust our communications. We do not have a way to understand when someone is who they say they are, when they're communicating in a way that is trustworthy, that we are ultimately falling for these sorts of things. Now, we're not applying the same standard that you would in an art gallery to figure out a work is authentic, or even to an NFT that you're buying for $69 million. Those are not the sort of things that we're applying to our everyday interactions, nor really should we. But there are things that we certainly can do to make this better. Ultimately, like many things, Calvin and Hobbes have said it better than I can. And with apologies to Reinhold Niebuhr, here you have Calvin saying, "You know what I pray for?" And Hobbes asks him, "What?" The strength to change what I can. We're pretty good at that in security. We're now actually able to change some things. The inability to accept what I can't. We're also unfortunately pretty good at that. And the incapacity to tell the difference. Hobbes tells him, "You should lead an interesting life." And Calvin says, "Oh, I already do." That is 100% where we find ourselves in the world of cybersecurity right now. In the cloud, we also see a huge difference between the sort of things that we were originally worried about and what we probably should have been worried about. If you can somehow rewind your thinking to where you were in maybe 2013 or 2014, back when you didn't necessarily have an Okta or Proofpoint or several other types of controls in the cloud, what were you thinking about in terms of why is cloud maybe a challenging idea for my organization to adopt? At the time, there was a huge amount of concern over the security practices of the SaaS providers. How can I trust them with my data? As it turned out, they were pretty good at hiring world-class security teams and doing much better than the average organization was with its own data centers, even a really well-resourced organization. We worried about the keys, the encryption side of things. Ultimately, of all the ways that data has been lost in the cloud, very few of them trace back to key management. We're also really hung up on availability. I am unfortunately giving this presentation, as always, with the worst possible timing, on the day after Office 365 had its login function down for an extremely long period of time, which you all as Okta customers probably did not have an issue with. But ultimately, those are the sorts of things that were really big concerns that turned out to be a little bit overblown if you actually look at the broad spectrum of what happened once we really were dependent on the cloud. And now I know this one might be a little bit more controversial, but I'd put shadow IT in that category too. For a long time, we were terrified of people using the sorts of apps that were not sanctioned by IT, that were not part of our officially canonized and accepted and risk assessed digital transformations. But frankly, smart IT organizations more often than not saw shadow IT as a cry for help from certain users, and ideally found them a solution to more securely do what they were trying to do anyway, which most of the time was just get their jobs done. At the end of the day, though, what we probably should have worried about more is taking the exact same problems that we were always dealing with in security and just moving them to somebody else's computer that happens to be on the internet. And pretty staggeringly, there's a couple of different ways in which this has manifested itself. All of the issues around access control, all of the issues around least privilege, all of the issues around putting a file on a file sharing site with bad permissions are no different in a data center than they are in the cloud. But we shouldn't assume that just by moving them to the cloud, things magically get better. Even some of the really interesting issues that continue to exist on premises, like the use of what are called living off the land binaries, or much more interestingly phrased lol bins, those exist in the cloud too, if you don't actually think about protecting them in some other way, or simply using something other than the binaries that are inherent to the system that can often get abused by a threat actor. So really, we were kind of in the wrong place when it came to something as fundamental as the cloud. And now I want to offer a really, really bold plan. I have 3 things that you can all do. And if anything has become clear over the last, call it 13, 14 months, we can do things that we didn't think we could do before that really would fundamentally change things when it comes to better security. And I promise my good friends at Okta did not pay me to say this. Number 1, kill your Active Directory. And think about it in a couple of different ways. Do you really, really need your entire user population to be able to print off the same printers right now? Have you printed anything in the last 12 months off anything other than a home printer? Maybe even not that? Really, at the end of the day, that was a technology that has been exploited so frequently because, yes, it does form a critical layer and we can't really undersell that, but it is exploited in almost every type of attack we see. Look at the Sunburst example, right? Or perhaps you know it as the SolarWinds incident. Where did that access always manifest itself? In Active Directory. At the end of the day, we had a couple of other really clear examples of issues that also can be traced right back to Active Directory. Think about Exchange servers, right? When we had a terrible Exchange bug that was there for at least 11 years, one of the reasons that was so dangerous is not just because your Exchange server and your email could be compromised, but because that Exchange server had a tremendous amount of privilege in Active Directory. Not just because the server itself was connected by ActiveSync to all sorts of different accounts, and threat actors could probably steal all those credentials once they had the ability to run code on the Exchange server, which again, facing the internet, was true all too often for many, many organizations, but also because the Exchange server, in order to basically do what it did in an on-prem setting, basically had to be effectively domain admin. It had to have all of the privileges. So even bad security issues become so much worse when you connect them to AD. Let's go back to the ransomware. If you had actually entered that order number in the Flower fake website and gotten that spreadsheet and run those macros, that would have been a compromised machine that would have then led the attacker to go straight after what? Active Directory. Map it out, figure out how to escalate privilege, and then ransomware the entire environment. One of the most powerful things we can do is try and get past it. And it might seem hard, but at the end of the day, when your world lives in SaaS applications and when your world lives in infrastructure as a service, you can move past these older protocols. You can move your directory to something that is a completely different architecture than what came before it. And anything that can't be strongly authenticated doesn't really belong in that world. Now, we left our offices behind. We managed to move so many things because we had to, because we felt the urgency of responding to COVID-19. I would argue that the security situation, while it's not quite life or death like COVID-19 clearly was, is that level of urgency. So killing AD here, and while you're at it, try and kill passwords too. That can really be absolutely transformative in terms of taking away things that every level of cybercriminal and threat actor relies upon. Second step, if you get past number 1 somehow without dying on that battlefield, your endpoints, right? If you look at organizations with an incredibly challenging threat model, if you look at a Ministry of Foreign Affairs or a political party, one of the things you might have seen them do, if you're familiar with what their security teams do, is they radically change the choices available to their end users. And you can do that. You can roll out Chromebooks or Mac OS devices or iOS and Android devices, or even Windows 10, as long as you turn all the security settings on. If you do that, there's a huge improvement in your overall attack surface. But even if you do those 2 big things, which again will be absolutely transformative in terms of taking away all of the options that are currently laid out like a smorgasbord in front of your adversaries, Then you get to the interesting challenge, which is really number 3. Fix what's left that you can't fully engineer out once you get to what currently looks a bit like nirvana, but is actually, and I promise you, very, very achievable. So what's left over at the end of the day that you actually have to still mitigate once you've done 1 and 2? Well, malware doesn't go away. If you have a compromised machine, then yeah, it's not quite game over, but you're dealing with a very different situation. Secondly, your people. They are still the number 1 target, and they are going to do things that you cannot necessarily model for, but understanding which ones are being attacked, which ones are showing signs of vulnerability, and which ones have access to the things that you ultimately care about is a huge, huge, huge step forward. Your people are also basically your insiders, the ones that have access to the things that ultimately matter. And that's part of doing their jobs. You can't take that access away from them. So understanding what they do is a huge part of things. And then finally, there's your supply chain. You can have excellent control, excellent risk mitigation over all the things in your own world, but if you get compromised through some access that your supply chain partner might have had, or in a more prosaic sense, your vendor gets themselves compromised and tells you to reroute that $3 million invoice to the wrong bank account, but that's not really them. That's a huge way to lose a lot of money to a cyber criminal that you didn't necessarily have direct control over. But the more that you can actually move to a strategy that looks like this one, the more you can feel like you're getting closer and closer to success. And now here's where I feel like it's worthwhile to point out organizations have done this. There are organizations that can live without Active Directory. There are organizations that are only running modern endpoints. Their applications are in the cloud. Their infrastructure is running on an infrastructure as a service platform. And yes, they do have the issues left that are on the right, but the issues on the right are so much better than what we're dealing with today. Now, if you look at how then you move on to that third bullet, how do you protect people? Well, there's a really straightforward way to do that. You really are solving 2 core problems when it comes to people. You're basically protecting them from the threats that target them, and those primarily flow over the email channel. There are cloud native threats as well, and then of course there's that entire notion of their ecosystem where their third parties might be used to attack people in ways that abuse the digital trust that again is built on such tremendously shaky foundations. Also, there's the parallel task of using effectively those same systems, in most cases, with the exception of the ecosystem, to protect the information that people create and access across email, across clouds, across their endpoints, ideally, those modern endpoints that I just mentioned. What that really looks like in practice, though, to go 1 click deeper is, well, you got to stop the threats that people fall for. That's malware threats, that's phishing threats, even basic identity deception threats that we would call something like an imposter threat. And ideally, you want to do that with modern looking technologies like opening links in a bubble, like browser isolation. You don't want to forget about the cloud, though. An account can be compromised in lots of different ways. And so protecting people means identifying that. It also means identifying the trust relationships that they've created with their cloud accounts. So things like one of the things we saw the Sunburst actor use, OAuth apps that basically connect to things like Office 365 or Google Workspace accounts. Those are really, really critical to be able to detect, because once you solve the core problems, the easy problems around phishing and multi-factor authentication and all the things that get 95+% of the noise out there, what you're left with is harder attacks that have to actually avoid MFA-driven controls. And malicious third-party apps are the key way that most cyber criminals, as well as more advanced groups, do that today. Thirdly, the people themselves. You can't forget about them. Understanding who's likely to fall for the social engineering that all of these threats, not all of these threats, but 99.99% of these threats rely on. And I'm not kidding about that number. The number of targeted threats that actually involve a technical vulnerability is basically 0. And in those technical vulnerabilities, there's not really a new one since 2018, and that was in Internet Explorer, if you want to have some idea how old they are. But of course, you also want to fit lots of different learning styles. This is not the sort of thing that we're used to talking about in cybersecurity, but really being able to tailor that training has huge impacts. And then finally, you want to be able to understand how impersonation is being used against you. That fraudulent email, that fake domain, that fake mobile app even. All of those things are all kind of part and parcel of understanding what impersonation attempts look like for your organization. And there's no reason not to apply those same techniques to your partners. Is my key supply chain partner being impersonated? Can I find a lookalike domain for them? Can I see some aspect of abuse there? Do they look like their accounts are compromised and are sending me phishing? How can I then better understand how to restore that trust? That's a really critical thing to factor in. And then ultimately, those lead you to an analytics path, right? And being able to actually identify in a world in which the attack surface is fundamentally human, where that attack surface is greater or lesser means looking at it through the lens of people. Who gets attacked? Who is likely to fall for those attacks? And who has the privilege that is ultimately most useful for an attacker to abuse? And if you can line that up with the controls that you have at your disposal to mitigate risk, not just removing things that we used to do in the past, like local admin, but moving them to, and I'm not even going to say the buzzword, a least privilege model really does become powerful and tractable when you're doing it across smaller groups of people. And ultimately, the parallel problem exists on the information protection side. Data might seem like it's everywhere, but it doesn't move everywhere by itself. It will, in fact, and I promise you this, not grow legs and walk away. People move data around. So if you can understand who is working with your data and use that across all of the ways in which data commonly moves, email, cloud, the web, your endpoints, to understand when a user might be careless, when a user might be compromised, or when a user might be a malicious insider, you can start to understand a really powerful way forward to, again, get to that third step that we all want to get to, even if we haven't fully solved step 1 and step 2. I will say we've actually built this. This is an organization that is running this tool right now. You might notice they have about 20,000 people, of whom a couple hundred are very attacked today as we look at this. Almost 1,000 actually are showing signs of vulnerability, though. And 7,000 people have a level of privilege, which in this organization's case means access to its customer information that is worrying. Other people have different forms of privilege, like they're in desktop engineering or they're the CEO. But when you put all of that together, the people that are attacked, vulnerable, and privileged, all at the same time, the people that are likeliest to get this organization in trouble today, there's only 25 of them. And you can see some of the titles there. They're not the ones that I would have guessed, but these are the people that need to be protected more. And that's one of the reasons that it really is so critical to look at your people-centric security posture. First off, it aligns with the risks that you want to mitigate. If you care about ransomware, if you care about our data breach, if you care about business email compromise and financial losses, they all run through your people. Secondly, it is the sort of thing that aligns to your organization's own way in which it understands itself. If you talk about people and departments and groups, that's how we are all structured. If you don't actually know who's getting attacked, though, you don't really understand that attack surface. And if you're picking and choosing across maybe a large global organization where to apply controls, this is one of the most powerful ways to do that. And then finally, we don't often realize just how bad things get when we don't shut the front door, which is, of course, attacks against people. The typical security operations center, and this varies, of course, vertical to vertical, and also it depends on your tech stack, but most SOCs spend somewhere between 50 and 80% of their time with incidents originating with people. That can be everything from an insider threat alert to, of course, your classic phishing emails. And ultimately, doing a better job protecting your people takes all of the burden off your team, your users, and all of your other downstream controls. And at the end of the day, if you don't do this, the risk is just too high. And aligning your security efforts in this world in which we are all people-centric in terms of how we think about our architectures, how we think about our protections, how we think about our worlds, aligning what we're doing with the risks that we face, and of course, the potential, the reason we hired all those people, to keep them safe, to keep them productive, to keep them connected in a way that's secure. That is, after all, what our core mission is as cybersecurity professionals. And that is, again, one of the reasons why it's been such a fruitful partnership between Proofpoint and Okta over the years. We're doing exactly what I was talking about in this presentation. We partner to understand who are very attacked people and to better protect them. Proofpoint can tell you who's being very attacked, and Okta can apply adaptive security policies to make sure that their risk is as low as possible. And for those people that you're always going to have in every organization, opening up that flower order, copying and pasting that order number, and trying to download those macros, we are able to automate protection for those people that just cannot stop clicking on things. Proofpoint sees them click, Okta can protect them. Ultimately, these are the sorts of people-centric controls that will really bend things in our favor, and I'm incredibly excited to share them with you. With that, that's the end of my time for today, and I hope to see you at the rest of the show.